Welcome back to our final panel of the day. I'm Platt Institute Chief Executive Officer Jim Voelkel. And you'll want to stick with us for every moment of today's program because at our conclusion, I'm going to present our organization's very first Legislative Achievement Award to someone who is making a positive difference in Nebraska's policy community. Now, I always think it's a good time to talk taxes in Nebraska, but our discussion panel is going to be a little bit different from those that we've had in years past. Today, we're asking what's next because the unicameral defied expectations in 2020. Despite all the difficulties this year, senators reached a major compromise on a package including a new property tax relief program that is expected to be implemented over the coming years. Today, we'll discuss whether Nebraskans consider the job to be done or if more significant tax reforms are still possible. I'm joined now by Nebraska Legislative Revenue Committee Chair Senator Ann Linehan, Blueprint Nebraska Executive Director Jim Smith, also a former Revenue Chair, and Tax Foundation's Vice President for State Programs, Jared Walczak. All right, guys, let's just jump right in here with the first question for discussion today, and it's going to be a question for all of our panelists. Give me your honest assessment of the legislature's performance in the 2020 debate. What did the legislature deliver by passing LB 1107, and does it address enough of the concerns Nebraskans have with taxes in our state? Senator Linehan, I'm going to start with you since you chair our Revenue Committee and you were very instrumental in putting that over the finish line. Go ahead, Senator Linehan.
Thank you very much, Jim, and thanks for having me today. I would give the legislature an A grade on this last session, especially considering the difficulties we were facing with being in session and being sent home and then told we would come back in June and then not going back until July when it's very hot and people get very tired. But the package, I don't think anybody was 100% satisfied with the package. Some were disappointed we didn't do more. But I think the fact that we have an improved incentive package, we have a property tax relief that's very transparent. So people will actually realize what they are paying in property taxes. And I think it made people pay more attention. We also, I think, delivered an option for the next funding that's reasonable and something we can do that helps UNMC. And finally, we did it all without decoupling from the CARES tax cuts. So it was a huge package in dollars. I, of course, would have had it over 3 years. We had to negotiate to 5 years. And I also want to give a shout out to Speaker Scheer, who kept us all in the room when everybody wanted to go home. So he deserves a great deal of credit. Excuse me, I'm sorry. But is it enough? No, I don't think it's anywhere near enough. We need a whole tax overhaul. Our structure is old, it's complicated, it's burdensome. It taxes property taxpayers too much. Our income tax rate is too high. We need to have a complete overhaul. I am very concerned about our future. I hear it every day from people my age, which is near or at retirement. They're concerned about being able to live here with our taxes. And I also hear it from young people, including my own children, who live here, or some live here, some don't. But young people today aren't afraid to move. So if they can go to several states with no income taxes, they're looking at living there. So I think we need to act, and we need to act in a big way.
Thank you, Senator Linehan. Mr. Smith, Jim Smith, would you like to weigh in on that same question? How did the legislature fare this last year with the passage of LB 1107? And I'm going to follow up with another question with you about where we go from here, but go ahead and give your remarks about that initial question.
Absolutely. I applaud Senator Linehan and her colleagues, the leadership in the legislature, for accomplishing what they did with the 1107 this year. I think no one knows better than Senator Linehan and I do, being chairs of the Revenue Committee, past chair of the Revenue Committee, the difficulty there is in getting unity around any type of change or significant change for that matter. So again, you're not going to get any criticism out of me as to what was accomplished this last session. I do agree with Senator Linehan that much more needs to be accomplished. But I think it's a good thing. Any day that you can put tax discussion at the forefront, I think is a good day, and I'm glad that they had that discussion. And from everything I could sense, I think there is an understanding that more is needed, and that what was accomplished was necessary, but it did not satisfy what Nebraska must do to have a more competitive tax code.
Jared, would you like to weigh in from afar in Washington, D.C.? You watch states across the country. Weigh in on the efforts of Nebraska this last legislative session.
Thanks. And yeah, firstly, the fact that there were successful efforts already puts you a cut above most states. A lot of states, when they went home sometime in March, barely came back. Maybe they came back in some distant sessions. Very few accomplished anything significant this year. So the fact that the unicameral was able to come together and adopt a meaningful tax package already distinguishes Nebraska from most other states. I think it was important. I think there are some really good things that come out of this legislation. I think it probably makes sense to think of this as tax relief more than as tax reform. It's a down payment on future reform, I hope. It provides some important relief. It does help address high property taxes in the state, which has been just this very important long-standing issue. I don't think all the structural pieces are there quite yet to make sure that that problem is addressed for the long term, not just in the amount of relief, but also in how you ensure that it sticks. And we can discuss, I want to discuss more later on how you do that for the long term, but there's relief here. The CARES Act component is really important. States have struggled with how to handle that, and Nebraska made the right choices pretty consistently on how to approach this to be in favor of getting businesses and people back to work as soon as the health crisis allowed. So I think that's very good. All in all, I think some very good moves, including making some important reforms to the incentive package in the states, moving from Nebraska Advantage to the new approach that I think is a little more consolidated and has some caps in place.
Thank you, Jared. And I want to remind all of our participants today that you can ask a question to the panelists by submitting them on the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Senator Smith, former Senator Smith, now the Executive Director of Blueprint Nebraska. One of Blueprint's focuses is introducing, in Blueprint's words, a clean sheet tax program to keep tax burdens as competitive, efficient, and as equitable as possible. Since LB 1107 doesn't change the tax structure, which we just discussed, how do we modernize the tax structure moving forward and achieve Blueprint's goal?
Great question, Jim. Next week, you will see a media release coming from Blueprint Nebraska that begins to frame the discussion that we believe we need to have through the remainder of this year and into next year about tax modernization and what tax modernization actually is. I think there's a wide variety of opinion of what tax modernization looks like. So we're hoping to use a number of voices, independent voices, to help frame that discussion. I think there's two elements to tax modernization or any type of effort. There's going to be developing the ideal plan, and that is what our number one task is to create the ideal plan absent of politics. And then there's the developing the strategy, the reality component of that, and that is what can you actually move forward through the legislative process. And of course, Senator Linehan, that's the tough part of this job, right? But we are working to develop the ideal tax plan at this stage, and it's only going to be achieved through a very a broad discussion with a number of voices. I can tell you what that would look, generally speaking, in parameters, what that would look like. But there is a group of tax subject matter experts that are working to put the details to that. I think you would look at eliminating or significantly reducing personal and corporate income taxes. I think you would need to broaden the sales tax base and to restructure the sales tax system to reflect our ever-increasing service-dominated economy. Keep the future growth of property taxes in check by making constructive changes to the design and the way they escalate, and then to minimize the stagnant economic effect of other local and state taxes and fees. We know that through the 15 signature initiatives in Blueprint Nebraska, there are also objectives and goals that we need to achieve, such as creating investment by business in our state, attracting and retaining a workforce. And to do that, you have to have a modern tax system that is friendly and is very competitive with our neighboring states and other states in the country that we compete with.
You mentioned a press release, a media release next week about some sort of a fundamental structure to your vision at Blueprint Nebraska of our tax system. What is the role of Blueprint Nebraska as we move forward with the tax debate?
Well, first of all, I think we all agree that there's clear evidence that taxes have an impact on whether businesses remain in a state, are attracted to a state, and what it does to our workforce. And so the role of Blueprint Nebraska will be to frame that discussion and to make certain that we deliver an ideal approach to tax modernization, one that helps us achieve the modern economy that has been laid out in the Blueprint Nebraska report, and to make certain that we work with the legislature to provide them what they need to be able to carry that forward and to build legislation around it. So we're hoping to have that report delivered at the end of this year. And so then 2021, the legislature can begin to do their work with that.
Thank you. Senator Linehan, you obviously chaired the Revenue Committee. You championed 1107 across the finish line in a fearless and wonderful manner. It wasn't necessarily the legislation you originally pushed forth. That was 1106, which had a few more structural reforms within the bill. Do you believe that there's still more work to be done with 1107 beyond the bill that was passed? And is the legislature capable of going farther of adopting this package after adopting the package?
I hope so. The reason I smiled during your comments, I don't think all those days were quite completely fearless. I remember thinking that we would maybe go home with nothing, which was a large fear, but we didn't. So I believe this is why I pushed on 1106. We need structural tax change. And it's got to be focused on reducing the overall tax burden. As chair of the revenue, and I'm sure it was quite similar when Senator Smith was chairing the Revenue Committee, many, many legislative bills are brought forward that switch taxes, either taking away tools that we use to keep some of our largest and most successful businesses in the state of Nebraska. There were several proposals to do away with those. They're called by think groups loopholes, and we have to get away from thinking that our tax burden isn't too high, it's just too high on me. The tax burden across the board is too high on all Nebraskans. So I'm hoping we can get there. And I'm just going to be frank, a lot depends on our elections. We've got 6 open seats. They're all competitive. We need more pro-business, pro-growth legislators who understand that we have to control our spending, and not just the state spending, but spending across the board, to lower our taxes, and we need to lower taxes for all Nebraskans.
Do you have any specific policies or changes to LB 1107 or other structural changes on property taxes that you want to talk about today?
Well, I think I've already spoken, well, I shouldn't speak for him, but a point that Senator Smith made, I think we have to get a handle on the growth in local property taxes, the escalating, I can't remember, it's very good wording, but the ever escalating increases in our property taxes. I'll go back to, I think, what are startling numbers. Between 2008 and 2018, property values in Nebraska across the board went up 80%. valuations went up 80%. Levies dropped 12%. Therefore, you had a over 50% increase in property taxes. Now, inflation in that same time, over the whole time, all 10 years, inflation was 17%. You cannot expect the taxpayer to keep up with a tax bill that is growing 2 or 3 or 4 times the pace of inflation. They just can't do it. So that's one problem we've got to solve. The governor last year or 2 years ago, and I introduced it for him, a 3% lid across all spending entities in the state, government entities. I think we're going to see something like that again. We need to make exceptions for growth. If you're a school district that's growing 10% a year, you can't live within a 3% lid. But if you're a shrinking school district or a shrinking county, you can't be spending more money than the people can pay the bill. So yes, I think we've got a lot left to do.
Well, that ties into one of our participant questions that I'm going to touch on right now. Senator Linehan, and you can address it. Schools are spending more and more every year in their district. Can you ever fix property taxes in Nebraska without first addressing education spending and limiting the schools?
I know. No. It's $4 billion a year. It's a huge amount of money, and it's important. And we need excellent schools. We need excellent public schools. We need to support all our institutions of education, but we need to figure out what's nice to have, what really increases scores, what helps the children learn and helps those students be most successful. That's where the money should be spent. Some of the things I'm not absolutely convinced are really increasing those children's ability for a better life. And that's where our focus needs to be on all our schools.
Thank you. All right, we're going to turn to Jared, who has a pulse of what's going on across the country as far as state tax policy is concerned. The Tax Foundation ranks the states annually on their respective business climate. Nebraska is currently ranked 28th nationwide, yet our property tax, we rank 41st highest in those rankings. How does LB 1107 change that ranking, if at all, Jared?
It really doesn't. And I want to explain that a little, because this does, LB 1107 does help the average taxpayer, reduces property tax burdens indirectly through the income tax. But firstly, it's through the income tax. That's where the relief is taking place. So that's an income tax piece in our perspective, not a property tax piece directly. Secondly, what we're doing is measuring tax structure. We're not looking just at how much are you paying, but how is that structured? How competitive is that design? And that's not really what this bill accomplished. So when we're looking at the property and wealth tax structure in Nebraska, we're looking obviously at the high property taxes that exist, the high and rising ones, a not terribly great property tax limitation structure. One exists, it's not terribly effective, it could be better. We're looking at the fact that there is an inheritance tax, that there's a capital stock tax. There's a variety of pieces here. The taxation of tangible personal property, obviously, which a lot of states have, but is very much an issue in Nebraska. All of these things are counting against Nebraska, and that doesn't change. And we can get to this more later, perhaps, but one of the keys as you address property tax relief, which I think really is an urgent, pressing issue in the state, but as you think about structurally how to do this in the long term, there are a couple of ways that you can address this, just categorically. You can impose limitations on the growth of property taxes at the local level. The state can do that and restrict that growth. You can have some sort of tax swap where some other tax is coming in and taking the place of some of the property tax collections. Or you can do something closer to a subsidy where you are reducing the effective burden of the property tax on the taxpayers by the state coming in and providing some of that back. And what we see right now sort of straddles the line between the last two. And I think the effort is to get closer to the second, but the risk, of course, is that in the long term, without some sort of constraint on the local governments and the growth of their taxes, a subsidy doesn't prevent them from increasing, it just takes away some of your burden. So to give an example completely outside of Nebraska, the federal government provides a tax credit for electric vehicles. Very generous. I think it's $5,000. For a while, it was $10,000. This did not mean that every person who bought an electric vehicle saved $5,000 because the price of electric vehicles rose. Now, it didn't rise by $5,000, but it rose by $3,000 or $4,000. and that got capitalized into the cost. And the risk in the long term, not probably this year, next year, or even the year after, but the risk in the long term is unless you get the structure right, you're going to see the state picking up some of the tab without addressing the core problem. And those property taxes will continue to rise, maybe even faster than they would have otherwise, while the state is holding the bag.
You mentioned what it would take to improve our ranking, Jared, and you touched upon tangible personal property tax. You also mentioned, I believe, inheritance tax. Why does the Tax Foundation consider those two taxes to be area of concerns for states? And Nebraska is one of very few that actually has a state inheritance tax.
Yeah, so both of those are important in somewhat different ways. So the tangible personal property tax, for those for whom that term may not be as familiar, this is the property tax applied to things that you can touch and move. When we think of property taxes, we often think real property, land and improvements, the structures on them. But for businesses, usually not for individuals, there's also tax on machinery and equipment and all kinds of other physical items. And this is actually a really complex tax because it's taxpayer active. The taxpayer needs to determine the value of the property, what its depreciation is, all of these different things, and track that and remit on it. So it costs a ton to comply with for many businesses, especially smaller businesses. It's also kind of the wrong way to tax. I mean, it's a tax directly on investment, so it's discouraging investment. We look at that as a bad thing. I think that's actually pretty universally agreed upon. That's not really a left-right issue. It's more of this is a tax that's bringing in revenue. How can we address that issue? Under LB 1107, we saw actually the elimination of a de minimis exemption of $10,000. Your first $10,000 of TPP was not taxed. That change doesn't actually make that big of a deal. I think you need to bring one back eventually, but do it in a different way, because as I understand Nebraska's de minimis exemption, it was just a payment exemption. It excluded tax on your first 10,000, but you still needed to go through the process of cataloging all of that, reporting it, filing a form. You just saved a little bit of money on that first $10,000. States that have higher de minimis exemptions are usually trying to save you the paperwork so that a small business that has something under the threshold, maybe it's a $50,000 threshold, and knows that they don't have it, knows that they're not even close to that, doesn't have to bring in an accountant, bring in all of this effort to file. They can just say, listen, I'm not close, I'm not filing. So that can save a ton of time. I mean, you can take like 2/3 of your taxpayers off the rolls of that thing for a couple $1 million. And that's not what Nebraska used to do with that exemption. So you're picking up 15,000, the paperwork doesn't change. I mean, 15 million paperwork doesn't change, but that's something long-term, there's reforms there. On the inheritance tax, it's not as destructive as an estate tax. Obviously, more states have estate taxes than inheritance taxes. Those encourage people, as they're getting up in years, and wealthier individuals to leave the state because their presence there, regardless of where those inheriting the property live, will affect taxation. Inheritance taxes don't really do that. The issue is that they can sometimes break up a business or change investment decisions. And in the lead up to someone's passing, there's a lot of tax avoidance activities that people take, and they're all really economically destructive. Now, Nebraska is pretty good on direct heirs. If your kids are getting it, it's 1%, not that big of a deal. If it's not your kids, not your spouse, spouse is automatically exempt, then it gets way more expensive really fast. And that's a concern that I think needs to be addressed.
Thanks, Jared. I'm going to open it up to a question for all the panelists and then sneak in a question from one of our participants that ties into this. I think the four of us all can agree that if we move forward with modernizing our tax system, that looking at sales tax exemptions needs to be part of this. Our sales tax code has not been modernized for several decades. We're much more service-based economy, and the revenue associated with these exemptions could be an ingredient and a major component of reducing property and other taxes in the state. How important is looking at our sales tax exemptions to the three of you as we look to improve our tax rankings on our tax system? So, Ann Linehan, you want to start?
I feel like I've had this conversation. I think it's important that we broaden our base. We had an effort a couple years ago, didn't go well. It's got to be part, I think, to be successful, of a much bigger package that's much better understood by both the members and the public at large. And we need to work with the governor to get anything done. One of the things I want to work in here, maybe this isn't the right place, but I think it's very important to say today. This year, we lost 6 senators due to term limits. At the end of the next legislature, we will lose 11. I believe 7 of those 11 are currently chairmen of committees. So it is not a time to take our foot off the gas pedal. We really need to focus these next 2 years. We've got a governor with 6 years of experience under his belt. We have a group of legislators who will be leaving that know these issues now. They understand much more clearly than they did when they walked in the door down there. So I am very hopeful, with the help of Blueprint and others across the state, that we can get right to work in January, well, before January, and talk about real structural reform when we have the people in the body that understand and have worked on this their whole careers down there and don't want to leave without something significantly done.
Thank you. Speaking of Blueprint, I don't want to anticipate what may be in your report, Mr. Smith, but can you touch on the expansion of the sales tax base as an ingredient and as a foundation for structural tax reform?
Sure. I'd like to, I guess, first comment on Senator Linehan's remarks there, and she is absolutely spot on, and really appreciate that type of approach to tackling this going forward. So really appreciate that. That's the type of leadership that we're really going to need to get things done. Addressing the broadening of the sales tax base is absolutely an essential part of this discussion. We have a very different economy today than we had years ago when the tax code was last modernized at that particular time. And we're going to have a different economy going forward, an economy that has to be more favorable to the type of investment we need to create the high-paying jobs. I think the real challenge will be, probably around business inputs and how do you define a business input? And there are some that define a business input very broadly. And then there are some that are much more narrowly focused in that business inputs are things that are consumed in the production of a product. And so that probably is going to be where the change comes in is, what is a business input? I'm predicting that may be one of the sticking points in the future, but we must absolutely broaden the sales tax base and reduce the overall rates to be competitive in our region and across the country.
Jared, the Tax Foundation since 2013 has been partnering with the Platt Institute, advocating for what we're talking about, and that's broadening the sales tax base and eliminating exemptions. Talk about the importance of that to Nebraska, and then I'm going to ask you the question from one of our participants. He knows that the Tax Foundation is active in Utah discussions. Although they passed some key initiatives to broaden sales tax base late last year, they drew back during the 2020 session. What lessons can Nebraska learn from the Utah experience? Appreciate your thoughts.
Yeah, that's a very good question. So firstly, with sales tax base broadening, it is one of those few areas of policy where almost the entire policy community is in agreement on the broad statement. If you ask almost anyone in public finance, what is the appropriate base of a sales tax, they would say all final consumption. That it shouldn't include intermediate transactions, but it should include all final consumption. Now, once you get into reality and you're doing policy and politics, there are lots of things that quickly go off the rails here. What sounds good in the ideal world doesn't usually happen. Every state taxes a significant amount of intermediate activity, the business inputs question. Every state makes a lot of policy exemptions for certain types of final consumption, and they defend those in various ways. But every time we get further away from that, we further distort what a sales tax is. We make it less stable, we make it less equitable, and we ultimately erode the sales tax base because of changes in consumption over time, which means that one of two things happens. Either we continue raising the rate on a smaller and smaller percentage of consumption, or we end up de facto shifting more to income and other forms of taxes that are less competitive economically than the sales tax. In both ways, I think we're losing out and we're getting something wrong. As both Jim and Senator Linehan had mentioned, the sales tax has legacy pieces in it. In Nebraska, it states to 1967, but really, you didn't invent the idea, so you were copying it from someone else, and ultimately, basically, everyone just copies what Mississippi did in 1932. Great Depression, create something really simple to implement. I mean, it was a dry goods tax fundamentally, and it feels like we just gradually built on that. That's obviously not what our economy is. We're missing a lot of elements of consumption. We're missing most of the service economy, and that's really important, both because it's a growth sector and we're missing what consumption looks like, and because it's actually shifting. It's not just this is new consumption, but it is a change of how we consume. People do not buy as much physical media these days. They buy digital media, or they buy streaming services. Instead of buying your own lawnmower, you might have a lawn care service. There's lots of ways that the service economy has picked up. I mean, this is less true in Nebraska than elsewhere, but where I live, people no longer have cars because they use Uber all the time. I mean, that's a shift in how we consume. And if you're not taxing those things, you're seeing a shrinkage of your base. And that's something that we clearly need to address. There's an equity issue as well, that services tend to be consumed more by high income individuals. So one of the traditional critiques, a valid critique of the sales tax, is that it can be regressive. Two different ways it can be regressive. One, lower income individuals consume more of their income, by definition. But two, that the type of things we're taxing fall more on low income individuals. The first one's tough. We've got to make those trade-offs, and we have to make some policy decisions on how we deal with that. The second is fully within the ability of policymakers to fix. And to me, that means you should go ahead and fix it. There's no reason not to. That business inputs question is really important, and it goes to the Utah issue to some degree. If the goal is to tax all consumption, you want to tax all of it one time. It doesn't actually matter at what stage you tax it. So the European model is like a value-added tax. You tax all of the inputs, but then you credit or subtract out all of the everything but the additional value. So that by the time it gets to the consumer, the whole thing has been taxed a million times, but only once on the entire, only 100% of the value of the item. It doesn't pyramid. The U.S. model is, of course, that you tax the entire value, not just the value added. And therefore, if you're taxing the raw materials, and then the packaging and the distribution and the marketing and all of the business costs and all of that under a sales tax, and then you tax the good, you're taxing the final consumption more than 100% of the time. So some take the narrow view that Jim referenced, that okay, raw materials, clearly keep those out. That's pure double taxation. But if the business retains a law firm, a marketing firm, if they have HR, if they need landscaping at their corporate office, those are not embedded in the product. So we don't tax. It's okay to tax those separately. From my perspective, that's not final consumption. Businesses that don't actually engage in final consumption, with limited exceptions, like fringe benefits or final consumption. Beyond that, no, it's a consumer sales tax. That's literally what it is. The reality is we're not going to get there entirely, but I think that that is the perspective that I have, and I think a lot in public finance have, that you want to avoid this pyramiding where it's embedding multiple times. And also embedding it means that you're raising the cost of doing business in the state, because the sales tax is on consumers wherever they are. But if the sales tax is directly imposed on the business, not passed along to the consumer, it makes it more expensive to produce something in Nebraska than one of your neighbors. So it's something to watch. The issue is there's this huge political question about what should businesses pay? Because even though that's not really what the consumption tax is about, it becomes this political issue if you're not taxing businesses enough. Or it can be on the flip side. So in Utah, classic example, I think that in September-ish, they had a really good plan. It taxed a lot of personal consumption of consumer services. It taxed even business services when they're more consumed by individuals. It had a lot of broadening. It was a good plan, not perfect, but pretty good. And then every industry came in and explained why theirs was the one exception. And by the time it got to November, suddenly almost all of the high-end consumer services were out. And the only thing left, the big expansion really, was groceries. And That's actually not bad policy. In fact, it's even good policy. People think, oh no, that's regressive. The studies indicate it's not, because we already, because of federal law, exempt purchases made under SNAP and WIC, and the rest of it actually is kind of progressive. It's not what you'd think. The studies indicate that if you use that to lower rates, you would actually be making the code more progressive, but that's not intuitive to people. And it's clearly not anywhere near as progressive as bringing in the high-end consumer services. So a lot of people felt it was a bait and switch. I think it was more just the way the political process played out, but it started out, oh, we're going to tax all these services, and it ended up you're just taxing groceries. They pushed that through at the very end. I think they had the greatest of intentions. It would have been okay, but there was a huge outpouring of opposition to this, and they reversed it almost immediately rather than fighting a ballot measure over it and having uncertainty in their budget. Now, you don't have that process, but nonetheless, there needs to be buy-in. This needs, I think, to Senator Linehan's point, to be part of a comprehensive package. And there needs to be a belief and a reality that you are modernizing across all sectors, not just picking one or two.
Thanks, Jared. We're going to go back to property taxes now. Earlier this session, legislation was heard in the Revenue Committee, LB 1212 and 1213, that would have increased the transparency of local property tax requests by requiring taxing entities to provide a direct written notice by mail when a public hearing is scheduled to consider it a property tax increase. This legislation was modeled after Utah's truth in taxation law. However, it did not receive a vote this session. We're going to start with you, Senator Linehan. Do you think this type of legislation will help with the property tax problem in Nebraska? And now that more of us are used to virtual meetings, can the state do anything to encourage local taxing subdivisions to offer more virtual options for taxpayers to both access and engage with local boards?
I'm for anything that brings more transparency to taxation, whether it's property taxes or income taxes, more transparency to government. I hope every day that we have citizens that want to tune in and figure out what's going on, because our government is very much dependent on everybody, or at least the majority of citizens, paying attention. So I'm all for transparency. I do think that we could probably, I don't know whether we need to legislate it. I think we need to encourage the ability to tune into your city council meeting, which you can. I believe, I don't know about city council, I know the Omaha Public Schools broadcast. You can go online, watch their school board meetings. They record them. You can pull them up for reference. I think there's a lot of institutions that could do more to make sure people can see what's going on. It's very hard in a world today. We've changed so much just in my lifetime. Used to have one parent working. Used to have always two parents. We don't have that. Even if there are two parents, they're both working. You have children involved in multiple things. It's very hard for family people who do care to break away for a 5 p.m. meeting or a 7 p.m. meeting or a meeting that's during work hours. There's just not enough hours in the day. So I think using more interconnection through the internet would be an excellent idea.
Jim or Jared, would you like to weigh in on that question? Either of you?
Well, first of all, I think one thing everyone probably on this call can agree on is that we want a more responsive government, local and statewide, even federal. And that transparency is absolutely key to that, as well as modernization of processes that we use to provide the necessary services to the public. But the one advantage, if you're able to accomplish that, is you're going to end up with a smaller, less expensive government to operate. So I think that's something we can aspire to. I would like to say that I think, everything I've read and I've been involved with, Nebraska is indeed one of the leading states in controlling the increase in spending of government. Governor Ricketts, even with his own department consolidations, gains and efficiencies, that's what we have to do to drive the cost of government down and to make it more responsive in doing so.
And I would add with the truth in taxation issue that Utah has that almost every state has some sort of property tax limitation regime. Nebraska is one of them. I think 47 states have something. A lot of them aren't very effective or have some clear flaws that introduce just new problems. A lot of states have assessment limits that really distort the value of properties and create a ton of inequities. There are two models that seem to work pretty well, and they're different. They can be complementary. One is the, of all states, New York and Massachusetts model, which is basically a levy limit. Instead of capping a growth of assessments from year to year or capping the rate, both of which have workarounds and also create disparities where one property across the street from the other is paying 3 times as much, and it discourages change of ownership, discourages investment, lots of problems with those. Instead, it says, going to Senator Linehan's point about how assessments have been rising, and they're rising way faster than probably the real cost of the services. It limits the amount of growth of revenues and requires rollback of all rates across every class of property when that rises too high. It exempts new property coming into the system. If there's new development, you need more money. But if everyone's property has appreciated 50% over X number of years, it's doubtful that the cost of services is appreciated by 50%. So it makes sense to have that limitation. So the levy limits have proven very effective. They have override procedures for voters to permit something if there's a reason for it. The other is just giving more transparency through a truth and taxation style bill like Utah has that is truly transparent. I mean, Nebraska and other states will have public hearings that no one shows up to, or only the most dedicated activists are aware of. But on the other hand, if everyone gets a mailing that says this is how much your taxes would rise if this went through, people get engaged. And what we've seen in both of these cases, in Utah and in states like Massachusetts and New York, is not that voters never let property taxes rise. It's that local government officials really build out their case, and they only ask for it when they think there's a good reason. And different governments will have different views of what's a good reason, and voters will have different views. But I think that's a healthy thing, that instead of it just being on a glide path where every year property taxes increased just because, instead there's this need to say, here is what we as a local government need to invest in. Here is why you as residents should be on board with this. And then either through an accountability and transparency approach, or through a voter-initiated approach to the overrides, asking the public to participate in that decision. Voters are often willing to go along with an increase if they think it makes good sense, but it really is a good constraint on the increases that are just incidental. And I think that's been a lot of the critique in states like Nebraska and around the country, that the default is that your property taxes go up every year. And these things, both the Utah style approach and the New York, Massachusetts approach, have been very good at dealing with that.
Those are my prepared questions for the panel. We're now going to move to the questions and the questions that have been submitted in the Q&A section below. And I encourage all participants to continue with your questions. I want to start with the first one. Since property taxes fund only political subdivisions of the state, is the legislature willing to rethink all of the duties it places on political subdivisions and or restructuring of the political subdivisions which the legislature created in the past? Anybody like to weigh in there?
I'll weigh in probably dangerously. I think that we need a study, and I don't know how we keep it out of politics. When I look across Nebraska, it's changed dramatically. We've had a population shift from the west to the east, actually from the north and the south to our major urban areas, Lincoln and Omaha, and anywhere 50 miles within that radius. So it's left a lot of small towns and communities, probably they're adjusting as they move forward. But I think it would be advantageous to the whole state if we did a study that included the governor, legislature, outside groups, think tanks, other people involved in local and state government, because we can't justify some of the stuff that's going on for the cost of it. It's just not justifiable. There's also, I think it would help, and Blueprint, maybe it's a way forward to address other issues, because I was very disappointed, frustrated, all of those, the lack of understanding of how the money flows for schools and local subdivisions and who gets what and who pays the bill. There's a lot of less than accurate information that gets repeated over and over again, that it just becomes fact because that's what people hear. So I think we really, with the chambers and everyone, needs to kind of be involved in a big picture look at what our government structures are in the state of Nebraska and what changes we need that would be beneficial. And we also need to look at those changes out over the horizon. When you talk about immediately, quickly changing, whether you're going to merge a county or merge a school district or whatever, the people, of course, get tense because it's their life. Nobody likes change, and it's jobs. So if we're ever going to get serious about looking at the size and shrinking and having a more responsive government, we need to look out over, I believe, like a 10-year to 15-year horizon and say, where are we going? And what is it going to look 15 years from now, and how should we adjust things so we're in the right place 15 years from now?
Jim or Jared, would you like to weigh in on that question at all? You don't have to.
It's a tough issue, and it's one that's a little out of our remit as a tax organization, but it's something that a lot of states are looking at and will have to. It's something that, cross-partisan divides. There's a recognition that local government size and organization is often a legacy of things that don't matter so much anymore. Sometimes counties or communities were based on how people could participate if they needed to be able to get there in a short amount of time in an era when there weren't cars. Some of those sizes don't make sense. So we see across the country consolidation not only of governments, but also consolidations of services. Maybe you keep the separate towns and cities and counties separate, but there are shared services that reduce costs where neither of them needs fully all of those levels of administration. So we're seeing a lot of that consolidation across the country. I imagine that will continue. I think the broader issue, though, is that there's a difference between when costs are legitimately arising and when taxes are increasing just because they are set on a path to do so, because any government can fill that gap. It is not hard to find new ways to spend. There's always something that looks valuable. I'm not saying that they're like spending just to spend. There's always the next project that you believe is good. But I think it is important to have a system of transparency and accountability that makes explicit to the public what those investments are if government is going to expand, so that they can be part of that decision-making process.
I think, Senator Linehan and I are of the same mind that government closer to the people is best. But then you have to weigh that against, can we continue to afford to spend on the path we're on? And where does it make sense to consolidate and to reduce those unnecessary costs? But can you achieve that by continuing to keep government close to the people and responsive to the people? So I think, Senator Linehan, your thoughts on a 10-year projection, a 10-year path to review and determine what it is that we are to be going forward, I think you're on the right path.
Senator Linehan, are there currently any proposals or solutions on the table or available to control spending? That was a question from one of our participants. And Jared, if you know of any plans across the country, that'd be worth the discussion here as well.
I'll just go back to 2 years ago. I introduced with Governor Ricketts, or for Governor Ricketts back, actually, the 3% across the board on everyone spending. The reason that number seems reasonable to many in the legislature and to the governor in particular is that we have managed for the last several years to keep our spending at or below 3%. So if we can do that when we're in charge of so much that the state depends on, including our significant resources that go to K through 12 public education, our support of the University of Nebraska, our huge amount of funding that we have to provide for those who cannot provide for themselves. I'm talking about children in foster care. I'm talking about older people who are in homes, who run out of money. We have huge needs in the state that we do address, and I think we do a good job. I think we have got to come up with a way to make sure that, to Jared's point, is a very good point, Jared. When you have these automatic increases, and a phrase that I got very frustrated with hearing over the last couple of years, well, we didn't raise the levy. Well, I don't care if you didn't raise, I even had an argument with elected officials, other elected officials, we didn't raise taxes, we didn't raise the levy. And their question to me was, explain to me, Luann, what you think raising your taxes is. And it's very clear to me. My taxes go up when the check I write to pay them is more than the check I wrote last year, just like anything else I pay. So I think we've got to find a way to, and I'd be interested in continuing the discussion with Jared about how other states have done that, because when it's automatic, and let's be honest, the people that show up to meetings generally, we know this from serving in the legislature, Jim, are the people who want something. They have a good idea. It's shiny, it's new, it's going to solve lots of problems, and it just costs this much money. So Jared's absolutely right. If you have money on the table, there will be good causes that come forth, maybe without a lot of background checking, that will be spent on that maybe aren't absolutely necessary, maybe not even that productive.
Jared, anything to offer?
Organizationally, our focus has largely been on tax structure. Our view is that within whatever revenue bounds a state or local government wants to operate, there's better and worse ways to raise those dollars. So the important political question of how much to raise, it's a vitally important question. It's not something you can get away from, but I think our approach organizationally is to work with people like Senator Linehan, with any other members of the unicameral or local governments, to help figure out how to structure those revenues rather than what levels they should be at.
All right, next question for all three of you. What do you think of the consumption tax only plan and eliminating all other taxes? That was something that we heard in the legislature this year, and it was a possible ballot initiative as well.
There are 9 states that to some degree do this. I mean, none of them eliminate all other taxes, but there are 9 states that don't have a wage income tax. 2 of those have a tax on investment and interest, interest and dividend income. 1 of them is getting rid of them. But there are 9 states that don't have an individual income tax, 5 states that don't have a corporate income tax. So it is done. Some of those states have very unique features of them, though. Several of them are very natural resource oriented states that can rely heavily on, say, severance tax revenue. That's not Nebraska, that's not your typical state. So they're not pure consumption tax states. And I don't think there's anything out there that is a 100% only consumption tax state. It's a question of whether you can get closer to that. I think it is a good goal to try to get closer to a consumption tax model because it's a more economically efficient model of taxation. It is more pro-growth. The income tax falls on both your present consumption and your future consumption, the investment and the savings you do right now. It's a tax on labor in a way that is much more indirect in a consumption-based tax. So a lot of the things we want to encourage through tax, through our tax structure, investment, employment, savings, those are discouraged under an income tax compared to what they are under a consumption tax. So directionally, I think that is the right goal. I'm also a pragmatist and a prudentialist. Where you are right now, there is a long ways between where you are and eliminating every form of taxation you have other than consumption-based taxes. And I think my perspective would be that shooting for that misses a lot of reforms that may be more achievable, more palatable, that are really important. I'm not a lawmaker. I don't need to make these decisions. I think if I were a lawmaker, though, I would see a lot of other things that are really worth doing that include reducing reliance on income taxes, increasing reliance on consumption, going in that direction, but maybe not focusing on an end goal that is challenging to achieve.
Senator Linehan, I'm going to ask you the next question. Why don't we take property tax away from community colleges as a mechanism to provide property tax relief? That's a question from a participant today.
Well, that goes right back to what Senator Smith said. People like their government close to them. I can see the reasoning where we would look at that. They're community colleges. We support our state colleges. We don't. University of Nebraska system does not collect property taxes. I can understand why that is something that we should look at. I think we will run into quite a bulldozer when all the elected officials on the community college boards and those communities, whether it's Norfolk or Beatrice or all the other community colleges spread around the state, I think they'd be very leery of the state taking over, because if the state's going to pay the bill, the state's going to run the deal. And that's where we're going to have the hardest time, I think, with property taxes in the state of Nebraska. At what point you want the state to pick up more? You can't have 100%, and this is part of the problem we've got today. We are, and it's part of the problem with 1107. Let's be honest. We're giving a tax break, but we're not controlling any of the spending. So it's not the answer. It's better than nothing, and we needed the incentive package, but we have got to figure out some way of what is the right amount of local control if, in fact, you want the state to pick up a huge percentage of your spending.
I got one final question for Jim and Senator Linehan as we close this panel, and it comes from a participant. You touched on it a little bit before, Senator Linehan, but is part of the problem in Nebraska term limits, and does that need to change? Former Senator Smith, you were revenue chair for quite some time and in the legislature for 8 years, and Senator Linehan, you're hopefully about ready to get reelected here and been instrumental in how we've moved forward from a tax structure. How much did term limits impact our ability to get things done, some of the big things done that the four of us want to see?
You want to go first, Jim?
Sure. So this is great. I get to talk about this from a non-blueprint perspective. So Blueprint doesn't have an initiative around term limits. That's we can easily say that, but I will tell you that I was a big believer in term limits before I went into the legislature. And I know everyone says, well, yeah, that's usually the way it goes. You become an elected official and you want to change the rules. But I will tell you that term limits may work well when there are two chambers in a state legislature, to where you can have that continuity and that retention of knowledge. In Nebraska, we only have 49 legislators, and I like to call them 49 independent contractors. And when we have them turning over so frequently, the only experience that you have is really going to be staff, and we're beginning to see a large turnover in staff even in the legislature. I would say maybe a happy median is about maybe 12 years instead of 8 years. I think the typical before term limits, if I recall correctly, the typical tenure of a typical the average senator was about 12 years. That seems about right, but I really don't think long term that the 8-year term limit, 2 consecutive 4-year terms, it really serves Nebraskans well.
Senator Linehan, we've got about a minute left before we move on to our award. I know this is a tough question to answer in a minute, but do you have any further thoughts above and beyond what Jim Smith just said?
I agree almost, I think 100% with Jim Smith. It's not good for Nebraska. It leaves too many people with less experience inside the glass than outside the glass. It leaves your members too dependent on outside interest groups who bring their own interests to the table. And people forget all of history. So everybody that's trying to explain what happened to you explains it from their point of view. It's just not the same as having been there, like actually been there. I think I've been lucky in the fact that I've been involved in government at different levels for years. So I remember sometimes when people tell me, well, this is what happened. I'm like, nah, it's not exactly the way I remember it. But it is, we're not going to do that. We're not going to get rid of term limits. I do think there might be, if we do our jobs, there might be an appetite for letting people go 12 instead of 8 years. I also think what you're going to see, and I think this is actually a good thing, you're going to see people come back. I mean, we've got Mike Flood's coming back. He's not been challenged. Hopefully Rich Pauls is coming back. Lathrop came back. Now, I'm not saying that that's a better answer, but I think you're going to see more of that because
Sure.
I just think it'd be helpful.
Well, thank you for a great panel, the three of you. You guys are exceptional leaders, both in the nation and certainly here in Nebraska. And thank you for your thoughts. But everyone, I promise we got one more announcement yet. Don't go away. Thank you for all those in the audience. We have one more announcement to share. I'd like to conclude today's program by presenting the very first Platt Institute Legislative Achievement Award. The Platt Institute is always striving to recognize and encourage efforts to remove barriers for Nebraskans through the legislative process. We believe there are more areas of sincere agreement and shared values among Nebraskans than politics leads us to think. That's why we reach out and work with a variety of legislators to make it easier to get a job or start a business, to create a better tax system, and to help Nebraska retain and attract talented people. This year, as so many small businesses in hospitality and food service were threatened with closure because of the pandemic, one forward-looking piece of legislation helped more Nebraska small businesses get their start in the food industry. Before the 106th legislature, Nebraska had an overly restrictive cottage food law, which is the law allowing the sale of many shelf-stable foods made at home. Previously, cottage foods could only be sold at farmers markets. Now, farmers markets are great places to start and grow a business, but they aren't available in all communities, and Nebraska's climate doesn't necessarily allow them to operate year-round. Thanks to the winner of our 2020 Legislative Achievement Award, not only can Nebraska cottage food producers now sell products made from home year-round without being limited to a farmer's market, they can even start online-based businesses without any cap on their potential earnings. This is because of a state senator's leadership in advancing Legislative Bill 304, which made its way through the Ag Committee and won unanimous approval in the legislature. As of last month, there are more than 200 cottage food producers registered with the Department of Agriculture, thanks to LB 304, producing cookies, bread, candies, and even roasted coffee right here in Nebraska. The winner of this year's Platt Institute Legislative Achievement Award is Nebraska State Senator Sue Crawford, representing District 45 in the Bellevue area. Senator Crawford, on behalf of the Platt Institute, I want to thank you for your dedication to removing these barriers for so many home bakers and food entrepreneurs, and for your persistence with this policy, which was not always smooth sailing. We are so grateful for your efforts and are honored to present you with the Platt Institute's 2020 Legislative Achievement Award.
Thank you, Jim, and thank you, Platt Institute, for this Legislative Achievement Award. It's an honor to be recognized for our work to open opportunities in the state to cottage food entrepreneurs. I appreciate the work of Nicole Fox and the Platt Institute in providing research and helping to mobilize citizen supporters of the bill. I also thank Senator Ben Hansen for prioritizing the bill to get it to the floor, and the Agricultural Committee for supporting it and voting it out of committee. Before all of that happened though, Barbara, a mom who loves to bake and needed to bring in more income for her family from home because she was caring for a family member, met me in Bellevue to share her story and encouraged me to take up the issue. Shana Bartow, my LA at the time, did a great job of getting our office started on this issue, and Hannah Murdoch, my LA last session, did a great job helping us to get this over the finish line. I'm glad that Barbara now has the ability to bake from her home so she can be home to care for her loved one, and that so many across the state can pursue their passions and add to their incomes. I also look forward to seeing what new larger businesses may crop up from successful cottage food startups. I appreciate the work of Platt Institute to uphold the nonpartisan nature of our legislature and work with senators of all parties. This cottage food success is just part of the nonpartisan effort by the legislature, along with the Platt Institute, to continue to reform our state occupational regulations so that we're providing as much opportunity as possible in the state of Nebraska while protecting public safety. Thank you again for this award, and thank you for your work on cottage food reform in Nebraska.
Thank you, Senator Crawford, and thank you to all of our panelists who joined me this afternoon, as well as everyone who made the time to tune in for our virtual legislative summit. We look forward to being of assistance to all of you in the 2021 legislature. A recording of this program will be available later at platteinstitute.org/podcasts. We hope you'll join us again for another Platt Institute program soon. Bye for now.